Welcome to Bookaholics, the Paris Institute for Critical Thinking's podcast series dedicated to books. If there's one vice that all of us PICT faculty have in common, it's our addiction to the written word. So in this podcast series, we introduce you to some of our favourite authors and books. Recent books, relevant books, our own books sometimes, but also classic books that we just can't seem to stop talking about. My name is Iain Mackenzie. In this episode, it is my pleasure to welcome Dipali Mathur, currently a Digital Scholarship Postdoctoral Fellow at the Institute for Advanced Studies in the Humanities at the University of Edinburgh. In this episode, we'll be discussing Dipali's recently published book entitled Available to be Poisoned, Toxicity as a Form of Life. This is published this year, 2022, by Lexington Books, and readily available from all good sources. Hello, Dipali. Welcome to the podcast. Let's begin with this question. Just could you give us an account of why you wrote this book and give us a sense of the main themes of this book?
Hi, Iain, first of all, and thanks for having me on this episode. Hopefully, you'll find this book interesting. You'll find something there for you. It's an interesting question. Let me just first begin by what really got me interested in this kind of research and in writing this book. And it was more a sense of realizing that a kind of abnormal condition, and not a kind of, but an abnormal condition of living with and being constantly exposed to toxic pollution has today almost become a normal condition of life, and has become an accepted part of life rather than something that gets us riled, drives us to action. We've kind of almost taken it as a part of our everyday life, something that we have to live with and something that's inevitable, as we continue to progress and modernize. So I suppose it was trying to understand that new kind of perspective, new way of looking at our everyday condition, that first got me interested in this research. And in this book, I have specifically looked at India as a case study. That's where I'm from. And, they always say, write about what you know. So that's what I tried to do, write about what I know. So the way that I've structured the book is by picking 3 case studies from India that I read as ongoing incidents and ongoing events of toxic pollution. And what's puzzling about these 3 case studies is, they're not new. The last one, of course, the last case study was a very last minute decision of mine to include in the book. It's on the COVID-19 pandemic. So hopefully most of you find that quite interesting to read. But these case studies were interesting to me because, as I mentioned before, this exposure to toxic pollution has been ongoing for decades. So, for instance, the first case study that I picked it deals with pesticides pollution in Indian agriculture. And today, Indian agriculture is facing this crisis where we're reading about farmer suicides, and we're reading about soil degradation, we're reading about water pollution, we're reading about food crops being contaminated with toxic chemicals. And one would think that this would make people angry. One would think that the government would take this as a priority, and act on it, but that doesn't seem to be happening. So there's almost this sense of being lulled into a slumber, and you're just taking these cases and these incidents of poisoning and pollution as, well, this is just a part of our everyday routine. So that's kind of what my book's trying to address, really. Like, what kind of a governmentality has led to this state of affairs, and what might be the way forward. But first of all, trying to understand how we can even begin to justify, um, living with ongoing pollution and ongoing toxicity, and being okay with that and tolerating that.
Mm.
So that was the first case study, of course, was about pesticides pollution in Indian agriculture. And the second case study is about the 1984 Bhopal gas tragedy. Again, interesting from this perspective because nothing really has been done in terms of remediation. The victims are still fighting for their rights. The perpetrators, have pretty much got away scot-free. So again, it's just a case of ongoing pollution. So that's what my book tries to understand.
Thanks, Dipali. And I think that gives a really, really rich introduction to the topic and the themes and the way that you were motivated to write this book. And it's kind of startling and quite shocking. And I think
Mm,
that's part of what you want to invite us into, that kind of sense that there's something quite shocking here about
mm,
um, you know, our sense of being in toxic environments being kind
mm.
of natural and inevitable and something we just have to put up with. I mean, when I
Right.
think about, how we normally kind of deal with that, is that when,
Mm,
scholars kind of reveal those things to us, we kind of go, oh, terrible, that's really bad. And who do we
mm,
blame? And let's kind of have a wee think about who we blame here. And it's the big
mm,
bad company that's poisoned the river. It's the
mhm,
lack of health and safety checks that led to the gas explosion. It's
mm,
something, and then of course we've got easy fixes
mhm,
around that. We can just kind of go, oh well, okay, now we know who to blame, we can fix it and sort
mhm,
it out. But you actually then take us into a different way of thinking about it
mhm.
through this sense of normality, of
Yes.
everydayness, of toxicity, because you take
Mhm,
us to a level, as you just hinted at there, of kind of governance. That something
mhm.
about this experience tells us something important about how people are governed. Could you say a little bit more about that?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yes, I think, and this is probably not novel anymore in the 21st century. And, it has been theorized before, but one of the central points that I make in the book is about the way that global capitalism, and particularly in its latest phase, right, let's call it a phase, whatever, neoliberal capitalism actually functions. um, and what I argue for in this book is that for the neoliberal capitalist machinery to keep churning and to keep turning, it needs, certain populations and certain places as available to be poisoned. And that's where the title of my book comes from, that certain populations and certain environments are deliberately made available for poisoning, for pollution, right? So this idea of not in my backyard, but it is in someone's backyard, right? And that's the point. All you're doing is displacing the pollution from richer parts of the world to the poorer parts of the world. And that's what I mean by these populations and these places being made available to be poisoned. So I'm trying to drive us towards thinking about um, this idea of chronic exposure to toxicity, not as isolated incidents here and there, but as very deliberate and conscious strategies that are required by global capitalism if it must keep making profits. And yeah, and I think that's a direction that the book's taking.
Actually, just for a little bit of an expansion around what you call, kind of the global capitalism in particular, but also the particularity of your case, which is kind of India. So that kind of, if you like, the kind of the national, the global, and how through the work that you've done in the book, you understand that relationship, broadly speaking.
Well, I mean, I suppose it would be a matter of um, looking at it through the I'm not very much in favor of these terms because they can be quite deceptive in certain regards. But for instance, the global north and the global south, the divide between the global north and the global south, um, and the ways in which toxicity and pollution is offloaded from the richer parts of the world to the poor parts of the world. And in this way, um, the costs or the consequences of profit generation, of prosperity, of modernity, and of progress, they're hidden away. And that's what keeps the machinery turning. When you can't make those obvious connections between your choices and your lifestyles in one part of the world and see its consequences in another part of the world. Um, and I think this is happening a lot, particularly with environmentalism. So, for instance, with the rise of vegan diets in the global north and in richer countries, I suppose, it is having detrimental consequences in the poorer parts of the world. And I was actually reading this very interesting article, which actually drew that link, and it said that women from very poor communities in India are the ones who are actually, being exploited for their labor in the cashew industry. Because with the rise of vegan diets in the West, the demand for cashew nuts has gone up. Um, and so these women in poorer parts of the world are actually, peeling the cashew, and as a consequence of that, of course, time is money. So they must do it as quickly as they can, and for that reason, they choose not to wear gloves because it slows them down. But their hands are peeled, and it's that kind of back-breaking work for a pittance. And of course, as a consumer, many of us are trying to do the right thing today, right? We are conscious of climate change. We are conscious of environmental and ecological collapse, and we are trying to make conscious decisions, but we can't see the ripple effects of those decisions. And I think that's kind of the masterstroke of global capitalism, isn't it? These networks are so obscure that it's hard to make those connections. So that's also what the book tries to do. um and this is not to say that, as a consumer, you're wrong and you should not, I'm speaking out against vegan diets or anything, but it's just to visibilize these networks that global capitalism has rendered invisible.
I wonder if you could say a little bit more about one aspect of the book that I found fascinating, given my own interest in the work of kind of Foucault, which I also suspect that our listeners might find interesting. I mean, you know, I would imagine, many people listening to this will be making certain connections around populations, governance, this kind of Foucault connection won't be too surprising. But maybe just in your words, kind of how you understood or understand in the book this, the importance of thinking about Foucault's work, particularly, I suspect, but you tell me, I suspect around notions of biopolitics and how he kind of framed these questions of governance himself.
I think a big influence for me has been Jasbir Puar's work, and the way in which Puar has reinterpreted Foucault for the 21st century. And this whole idea of toxicity as a form of life and being available to be poisoned is coming from, is heavily inspired, I have to say, by Poir's work as well. And Poir actually says in her book that it's no longer simply a matter of letting die. Neoliberal capitalism is actually disabling populations, and using them as labor, as exploited labor. So simply letting die or directly killing is no longer serving the purpose of the global capitalist machinery. Disabling populations and letting or leading them towards a slow death. And again, we can think of Lauren Berlant here as well. Berlant's idea of slow dying or slow death. These are some of the concepts or some of the ways in which Foucault's work has been interpreted in our recent times that have really inspired my ideas in this book. And I found them very, very interesting for understanding what's happening today, with the surplus or excess populations, right? So this surplus or this excess is being reserved, um, for poisoning, for maiming, for exploitation, for oppression. And that's not an exception, though. That's part of the normal functioning of the biopolitical machinery today. So that's the way in which, I've tried to understand our 21st century global political situation.
Yeah, for me, there are a lot of resonances here with what I like to think of as the kind of one of the apparatuses of control within
Hmm.
the kind of neoliberal, shall we call it, just for the sake of it, kind of global north, which is that
Yeah.
you have to be stressed to just the right amount. And in a
Hmm.
sense, what you're saying is that one other element of this is that you have to be maimed or poisoned to just the right amount, and that these just the right
Absolutely.
amounts really help kind of the functioning of this new kind of governance. I think it's
Yeah.
fascinating stuff, Dipali. I mean, I wonder if I can just broaden it out a little bit,
Hmm.
to kind of think about, you know, what we will also be familiar with, as kind of readers of your work, but also as listeners to this discussion, that this has got to fit into kind of broader ecological concerns for us, that we can't help but feel now that we kind of need to take your work into account as we think about our ecological choices. I mean, you've given examples there as well about diet and so on. So is there something that you think we miss, that's kind of that's a crucial miss, if we don't take into account just exactly how toxicity is becoming a way of life for people? Are there lessons, if you like? I mean, maybe that's not even the right word, but are there lessons to be learned from your work about how we should engage with the climate emergency, you know, above and beyond, let's call it the straightforward or the obvious, reduce emissions, reduce waste, etc., etc. Is there something here around the governance about these populations who are maimed to just the right amount, that we need to take on board for the bigger picture of dealing with the climate emergency?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ian. Of course, I hope that for the readers, and for the listeners of this podcast, like everyone's able to take away something, in terms of how they can reread or reinterpret our global scenario today. But the difficulty, I think, and this is something I've just mentioned previously as well, but the difficulty really lies in not being able to draw those links because they're obscure, because they're deliberately hidden from view. So, how do you then do due diligence as a consumer? How do you really do the right thing? It almost becomes an impossible problem. Because how do you then know that the choices that you're making today are actually environmentally friendly? They're actually sustainable choices. They don't have some kind of hidden consequences for people in some other part of the world. And maybe you're now living a cleaner lifestyle, but at the expense of someone in India or Africa or South America. Um, and it's a tough one. It's a tough one, but I think it's a matter of awakening as well. I think we need to be quite conscious of the larger narratives that were being told about how to solve the problem, very often about what the problem is, first of all, but also how to solve the problem. Because, like I said, the example I gave about vegan diets, um, most often today, there are ripple effects of choices that we're making in privileged parts of the world. And the consequences of these choices are being felt by the most vulnerable social groups in other parts of the world, hidden from view. Um, so I think it's just a matter of trying to think more critically, doing deeper research about the paths that we're choosing, um, and not simply buying into the narratives, the environmentally conscious narratives, many of which are actually coming directly from big industry, right? And you're being Another example that I love giving is about recycling. And I think today almost all of us know about the recycling scam, is what I'm going to call it. We know plastics are not being recycled, but we as consumers are doing our duty. We're sorting out our rubbish, we're putting it in the right bin, and we're doing everything we're being told to do, but we don't actually know what's happening further downstream in the supply chain. It's all just being mixed up, dumped in landfill. It's being sent, shipped across to other parts of the world, poorer parts of the world with lax regulation. And obviously, the most vulnerable and marginalized communities in those parts of the world are actually sorting through this rubbish without protective equipment. Plastics are just being burnt in open landfills, or they're being dumped in the oceans. So I think the awakening, it's happening. Definitely, it is going to take time, and that's not entirely the fault of the consumer. It's because it's been so deliberately obscured by industry and by governments, that people might not have direct access to that kind of knowledge. But I'm glad to see that, there's definitely a change. It's definitely that awareness, much more so today than, say, 20 years ago, perhaps. So I think we might be heading there. There's a ray of hope.
Dipali, thank you ever so much for this conversation. I think it's clear that this book, Available to be Poisoned, is genuinely eye-opening. It
Mm.
really does give you a sense of looking at the world differently. For me, though, equally important with respect to your work is that it's kind of mind-opening. And it's
Oh, I
mind-opening in
hope
the
so.
sense that
Thank you.
it really gets us thinking differently about what it means to be in toxic environments, how these toxic environments then do function in relationship to the non or less toxic lives that we hope to be leading, and so on and so forth. And those questions of governance, um, national, domestic, international, for me are really at the heart of the book. And I think you do it so well to kind of explore what's going on there. So this brings us to the end of yet another Bookaholics. If you, our listeners, would like to support the volunteer work that we're doing at our non-profit institution, the Paris Institute for Critical Thinking, you may consider becoming a member of our community. You can find more information on how to join PICT on our website. In the meantime, my name is Iain Mackenzie. I was joined today by Dipali Mathur, author of Available to be Poisoned, Toxicity as a Form of Life, published in 2022 by Lexington Books. And I hope we have the chance to challenge you with another PICT podcast soon. Goodbye.
Thanks, Ian. Goodbye.